We talked about how important that interview was with former Secretary of State Dean Rusk in 1969, and you did a number of interviews after that, though, and I want to kind of do almost like a word association game and mention some names, and you just tell me whatever comes to mind about those interviews and those individuals. Let's start off with Truman Capote.
His voice was so odd that when we first put him on the air, the producer didn't think that he should even be on. Because he was also very effeminate, and in those days it was very difficult for an audience to take. The mind was brilliant and witty, but we had a very hard time even putting him on the air.
Did you get a candid interview from him, you believe? Do you think?
Yes, in the beginning, and then at the end of his life, I did other interviews when I came to ABC, and then it was really very, very touching and sad because he was in a whole other place in his personal life.
Lucy Johnson.
The blue-eyed member of the brown-eyed family, she used to call herself. She was the maverick. I went to Interlochen, a musical camp, to interview her. She was very natural and very charming, unlike her sister, who was quite studied. And I never interviewed her, Lyndon Johnson, but I'll tell you what I remember. I remember going into his office one day. I was just really beginning, and he had to give up smoking. He'd had a heart attack. First of all, I remember he asked me if I wanted a Fresca. I didn't know what that was. I mean, now I know it's a drink. I thought, what's he asking me? Do you want a Fresca? And then he talked about smoking, and he said, because he was so, you know, all the stories about his being so, I don't know what, open and outrageous sometimes, and he said, I had to give up smoking, and I said to the doctor, I'd rather they cut off my sex. And I, what? You know. But Lucy was the charming, still is today, sort of outspoken member of that family.
Rose Kennedy.
Smart, strong, knew everything that was going on, knew the things that her husband was doing in terms of his other relationships, what was going to keep that marriage together. Beloved by her children, spiritual, but very down to earth. As I talk about her, I see her in Hyannis. I spent some time there, especially with her daughter Eunice, the mother of Maria Shriver. Tough in the best sense of the word. Look what that woman withstood.
Was it a difficult interview?
No. She had a great deal of charm and a twinkle. No, it was a good interview.
Ingrid Bergman.
Ingrid Bergman at the end of her life was very open. In the earlier years, it was more difficult. As you talked about her, I think of the only interview that I did with Grace Kelly, because in a way they were similar. Grace Kelly had married Prince Rainier, and I went over to Monaco to do that only interview. And it was very hard for her. I thought my questions were benign. Every question was so difficult for her. And I remembered at the end, and I don't have much memory for interviews really, I said, are you happy? And she said, I have a certain peace of mind. And when the interview was over, I mean, she almost broke down in tears. It was so difficult. And I realized then that a lot of actresses who are used to scripts find it very hard when you're talking to them one-on-one, to this day.
Lady Bird Johnson.
I've done many interviews with Lady Bird Johnson, one fairly recently, now that I've been on 2020. And I remember having to ask her a very difficult question because there were all the rumors about her husband and women. And it was, and I'm not even sure I should have asked it. And she said, Lyndon loved people and women were people. She is a great woman, Lady Bird Johnson. When I went back to interview her a few years ago, she's nearly blind. Her adoration of flowers, because she was doing a whole project with wildflowers. Her love of her husband. Again, these were women who knew their husband's frailties, but also saw their greatness. A remarkable woman. I hate to use the cliches about her. Great strength and an inner peace.
Is she easy to interview?
You know, most first ladies are easier to interview when they're no longer first ladies. We all now would love to do an interview with Nancy Reagan. I'm very careful not to talk about it when I speak to her because she's become a friend since she left the White House. When you're talking to somebody while they're in the White House, they're very guarded. The tendency is to be more open when they're out.
Well, another former First Lady was Mamie Eisenhower.
I loved Mamie Eisenhower. Mamie Eisenhower is the most wonderful character, and I did the last interviews with her, and I think almost the only interviews that she did. I did them up at, was it Gettysburg? Is that where she was living?
Yeah.
Yes. I remember asking her what made this marriage work, and she said, I'll tell you what made it work. We have absolutely nothing in common. I'd interviewed her and President Eisenhower on one of their anniversaries. Then he died. And I went back and did the last interview with her. And she talked, people had said then that she drank too much. She was aware of it, that people said this. And she said that she had an inner ear imbalance and that there were these accusations about her. And she said, you know, I drink tea. But I loved interviewing her because she was warm and folksy and funny and totally lovable. And the last of her generation, very feminine, the bangs, the frilly clothes, didn't want to be anything else but, you know, a good wife and play bridge. I loved her. She was cuddly.
She answered questions easily?
She did answer questions easily at that point because, you know, she wasn't going to, she knew, I think, that she wasn't going to be doing any other interviews. I have interviewed quite a few people towards the end of their lives, sometimes here at 2020. I remember doing the last interview with John Wayne before he died. He went in the hospital one day after our interview and never came out of the hospital. I did the last interview with Bing Crosby. You know, it's not that they do an interview with me and then pass on, heaven forbid, but when a person comes to a certain age and they know that they're, in a sense, speaking maybe for the record and maybe for the last time, they're very revealing.
You also interviewed, going back to Mamie Eisenhower second, her granddaughter-in-law, Tricia Nixon.
The interview with Tricia Nixon came about because...
Actually, it's not, let me correct that. That's Julie Nixon, who was her granddaughter-in-law, but Tricia Nixon.
Well, I interviewed Tricia Nixon. I covered Tricia Nixon's wedding. And Ed Newman and I did it, I think. It was the only time that I remember, it was so strange, but I remember watching Richard Nixon and his wife dancing, and she put her arms around him, and he stiffened. Strange. It was a beautiful wedding. I mean, Tricia Nixon was a fairy tale-looking bride, long blonde hair. I mean, she looked like a princess. Julie was very different. Julie was dark-haired, much more open. Tricia was and is very reserved. We covered the wedding in the afternoon. We replayed it at night. It was such a big event. I interviewed Mrs. Nixon. She did almost no interviews. She was a lovely woman, very hard to talk to, but lovely when you did. I always felt very sad about her because she was just coming into her own when Richard Nixon went to China. She was wonderful there and wonderful with the Chinese children and so forth. And then just a few years after that, Watergate happened and her world closed in. But she only did one or two interviews, and I did, you know, maybe the only one, or maybe there was one other.
Fred Astaire.
Fred Astaire. Well, terribly shy. Very, very hard to talk to. Very modest. And years later, when I was working then at ABC, I did an interview with Fred Astaire in which he revealed for the first time that he was going to remarry. And like a damn fool, I held the interview up because I had a special. And it leaked out before I aired it. And I learned then, if you got it, show it. If you got it, put it on the air. But he was a very, very shy man. Did few interviews and was hard to talk to. Nice, kind, but almost impossible to talk to.
Prince Philip.
Prince Philip was a difficult man. Prince Philip came to Washington. I wanted to do an interview with him. He said no. And it was a day that I was interviewing Tricia, as a matter of fact. And Richard Nixon came out, you know, what's the way to a father, his daughter. And he came out and said, I'm having a dinner tonight for Prince Philip. And I sort of teased and said, yeah, it's a stag dinner. And he said, do you want an interview with him? And I said, Mr. President, I'd love one. But he said no. And Richard Nixon said, I'll get it for you. And he must have said to Prince Philip, I'd like you to do this interview with Barbara Walters. I'm sure Prince Philip thought that I was a real pain in the butt. He was flying back to England the next day, piloting the plane for a while, and he stopped off in New York and did an interview with me. And what I remember most is that in the interview, I said, do you think that the Queen will ever abdicate? And he said, no, but who knows, anything can happen. And that made headlines in Great Britain. Headlines. Anything can happen, maybe she'll abdicate. So I wrote him a letter of apology. And he wrote one back and said, you know, don't worry about it. I mean, you know, this is the way the press is. And he signed it Philip. And I always joked and said, from now on, I'm going to sign my letters Babs.
Henry Kissinger.
I did the first interview with Henry Kissinger. I had to tell people who he was. His accent was so strong. People did not, this was before he was Secretary of State. He was a national security advisor. I remember that he wanted to take me to dinner before. He tells the story himself, because I'd seen him the day before, and I said, no, I never have dinner with anyone before I do an interview. I also remember, because it was a very, at that point, substantial interview, but he was a bachelor then, and I remembered saying to him, you know, you're the new sex symbol of Washington or something, and how do you feel about it? And he said, I love it. Now when I bore people, they think it's their fault. I've done many interviews with Henry Kissinger since, including taking him when I was on 2020, going back to the small German town in which he grew up, where he was not allowed into the soccer games, and he loved soccer, and he used to stand outside pressing his face against the mesh, and he was not allowed because he was Jewish. And we went back to the small town with him, and we walked down the street to look at the building where his parents had lived. And we walked in unannounced, we thought, to the soccer game, and he was recognized. And the soccer team stopped, and everyone in the stadium stood up.
Wonderful. Well, talking about trips, you're in Germany at that time, right? Let's talk about some other trips that were important that you took, and let's go back for a second to China again. You just briefly mentioned that, but I think we tend to forget what it was like going to the dark side of the moon.
It was really, I mean, it was a different planet. Everybody wore the Mao outfit. You couldn't tell the men from the women. Everything was programmed. You couldn't see anything on your own. I was broadcasting with the difference in time. I didn't go to the big banquets because I was on the air in the morning. If you left something in your room, like a piece of Kleenex, it was returned to you the next day, almost washed. I was very new at things then. There were a very small group of reporters who were going there, and there was a great question as to who could go, because you had to be able to do many things. You had to do radio, you had to do television, you had to carry your own equipment, you had to do tape recordings, because it was a small band from each network. By the way, my colleague then, Diane Sawyer, was there too, because she was working in the press department for Richard Nixon. She was recently, I guess, out of college and was working in the press department. Helen Thomas, whom everybody knows, the great lady from all of the press conferences of the presidents, she was there. I have a picture with myself on one side of President Nixon and Helen Thomas on the other, and I looked at it and thought about myself, pushy cookie. But it was another world. And I remember meeting Zhou Enlai. I can't remember. Oh, I never kept a diary. I may kill myself for only that reason. If you ever hear that I'm in deep despair, it's because I never kept a diary. But I do remember President Nixon introducing me to Zhou Enlai and saying about me, she's in training. When
How did you land that assignment? How did so few people got to?
Because we were going to be doing a lot of reporting on the Today Show. We were going to do 2 hours. And again, I could write my own material. See, I could do all of those things there. I could write it. I could do reportage. I was able to speak without having to have notes. And the Today Show did 2 hours every day of it. But then I also had to report all during the day for all the different radio assignments and so forth. So you really never slept. 2 years later, when I went back with Gerald Ford, it was a much larger camera, not just camera, but the whole reporters was almost twice as large, the whole group of reporters. But And there were some great names. Bill Buckley went on that trip, and Teddy White went on that trip. And it was really extraordinary time.
Well, you made another historic trip to Israel as well, and I'm talking about the trip that you made to interview Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan. Let's talk about the significance of that interview for a minute. That was a very important interview.
The thing that was probably the most important about that interview is that Moshe Dayan never did interviews. He was a very independent man. Today, you know, it's very different. Every head of state knows what the programs are, what the ratings are, how much time will you give me, will you do it live, will you do it live to tape? Those days, none of that happened. And it was the 25th anniversary of the State of Israel when I went over. I had interviewed Golda Meir many times. Remember that she was born in this country. She had a sister in Connecticut. She used to come into the Today Show studios with her sister who looked just like her. Her English, of course, was perfect because she'd been born here. So we had done a great many interviews with her. Moshe Dayan had never done an interview before. And he became, as it turns out, a very great friend. And when I went on to ABC, I'm going to skip ahead now, but I was, as I mentioned earlier, the first woman co-anchor of a network news program, and we were a great failure. It was Harry Reasoner and me. He didn't want a partner. It wasn't that he disliked me. He didn't want a partner, and I was forced on him. I had come there because I'd been told that it was going to be at least 3/4 of an hour of news. Now they can barely fill a half hour. And that I would be doing interviews on it. Well, the affiliates hated that idea, and it was a half hour. And I was hated. I was the $1 million baby. Supposedly I was getting $1 million to do the news. I wasn't. I was getting the same amount of money as Harry, which was $500,000. I was thrilled. It was a terrific salary. And the other $500 was to do 4 one-hour prime time specials, which to this day continue. I was making more money than that at ABC because I was doing the Today Show, and I was doing another show, by the way, called Not for Women Only. Every day, a half-hour audience participation, sort of like Oprah does or like Phil Donahue did. People have forgotten that. But in any event, the very first night that I was on, I had Anwar Sadat on the first night and Golda Meir on the first night and Anwar Sadat the second night. And it was a Yom Kippur holiday. It was in October, I remember. And I wanted to do interviews with them. Now, it would be natural for Peter Jennings or Tom Brokaw or Dan Rather to do interviews. They do it all the time. Then it was way ahead of its time. And the news director switched it and put Anwar Sadat on the first night. And so Golda Meir we played on a night that was a holiday. And she never forgave us. And she was probably right. And I remember the Anwar Sadat interview. He said, "You are making $1 million, Barbara." This is live television. And I said, "But you have all those houses." In any event, doing that show, and the show failed. ABC, first of all, was third in news. We didn't have much of a chance. They didn't spend much money. And the animosity began to show. I became the underdog. It was the worst time professionally of my life. I was drowning and there was no life preserver. And finally, Hugh Knowledge came in, the great innovator at ABC News. And Harry Reasoner went back to 60 Minutes. And Peter Jennings was put on from Europe, from London, and we had 3 different anchors. And I began then to work my way back, and it was probably the best thing that happened to me. And that is when I did the major interviews probably of my life. An unbelievable time with Fidel Castro, where he took us across the Bay of Pigs, the first Americans to have crossed the Bay of Pigs since the American invasion.
How many interviews have you done with Fidel Castro?
2.
2.
This was the major one. And then we traveled with him. He took us through the mountains where he had been a guerrilla. We spent the night, all of us, in his camp, hidden someplace, I don't know where. And there were very bad things about Fidel Castro. I don't forget that, and we didn't then. But I remembered I'm skipping around, but we had an amusing moment because when we went through the mountains, he was driving. There were fjords. They had hoped that this would be a tourist area. They were going to build it up, and of course it never happened. And we would drive up and down, and he would be smoking that cigar and blowing it in my face with his gun on the floor. And I would pick it up when the water seeped in. And we would stop at certain places, and there were children, and he'd give them candy and so on. It was an unbelievable trip. And when we went to this hideaway, he gave a dinner for us, and he had Algerian wine, I remember, and a suckling pig and so on. And we did some toasts. And he said, he was joking. He said, you should pay me. And we said, what will we pay you for? He said, well, pay me as a guest. We said, you're so long-winded. Because, by the way, our interview had been, when we were in Havana, 3.5 hours, which they played again and again and again on Cuban television, editing out the questions about prisoners and torture and so on. That wasn't it. And he said, oh, well, then you can pay me as a director. We said, you're a lousy director. You know, and we were teasing. And finally he said, well, what do you think? And we said, we'll pay you as a driver. You're a mediocre driver. We'll give you $5. And we all signed it. Okay, that's the funny part of it. But in terms of it being, in that sense, a very important interview, it was. And by the way, it came in second in the ratings. I think it was beaten by Goma Pyle or something. Mm-hmm. But that's when I spent a great deal of time in the Middle East with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin when Jimmy Carter was president. And that's when I did the interviews with the Shah of Iran. That was probably a period in my life that will never happen again.
Well, let's go back a second here. Why did you leave NBC to go to ABC?
I was offered, I'd been in the Today Show for 13 years. I had then a 7-year-old child. I was not married at that point. 13 years is a long time to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was offered this position as to be the first female co-anchor. And people thought it was the money. As I said, I was making more money at NBC, but I thought it would be a chance to have a normal life. I wouldn't always be exhausted. I used to see, it wasn't just that I was doing the Today Show. I would be booking guests all morning, you know, to try to get special guests. By that time, we had competition. Good Morning America had started on the air. I thought, I'll have a normal life. And I'll be able to be with my child more. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. And I then one day just, you know, I held my nose the way you're diving into something and said, yes, I'll do it. I had a contract with NBC that wasn't up until October, and this was like April. And it was the worst summer of my life. I felt I'd made a terrible mistake. I missed NBC. The conventions were on then in Kansas. I went to them in sort of no man's land. I knew no one at ABC. I knew by then that Harry Reasoner didn't want me to come. We did not have Rue Knowledge there. It was not a good news department. It was a terrible time. And I was on it for about a year and a half, the worst time for me professionally. Terrible press, you know, as if I was some, I don't know, chorus girl that had come out of Radio City or something. I mean, there were terrible cartoons of me, in part because I hadn't come from the United Press or Associated Press. I was raised in television. Today there are generations who are. In those days they were not. And I was a woman. And here was this wonderful, grizzled Harry Reasoner who had this, you know. And what saved me, if anything did, were letters primarily from women who said, hang in there, if you can do it, we can do it. And one telegram that I got one day, and this was somebody I hadn't known, and I opened it up and it said, don't let the bastards get you down. And it was signed John Wayne. And years later I did that wonderful, oh, what a terrific man he was, interview with John Wayne. But it was a terrible time. But again, I say to young people, sometimes you have to go through something like this to know that it wasn't all luck. And to know that you can work your way back at whatever it is, because I did, and it took years.
Who was your producer when you were co-anchoring that show? Was that Robert Siegenthaler?
Robert Siegenthaler, very, very nice man, but you know, he couldn't, it was too hard for him to cope with, you know, with the animosity that was going on.
Talk about Harry Reasoner again, just a second here. What was he like? Did you know Harry Reasoner before?
I had known Harry Reasoner because, strangely enough, when I'd gone to China with Richard Nixon, Harry Reasoner had been, I think, their correspondent there, and I'd also seen him when I was in Atlantic City before I went on the air during the Lyndon Johnson convention, and we were pals. I thought he was very wry and amusing and charming, and I guess I should have met with him beforehand and said, how do you feel about it? That never occurred to me. And he never disliked me personally. Years later, after he'd gone back to CBS, he wrote a book, he wrote an autobiography. And I did the interview with him for the Today Show, and he said, I never disliked you personally. But he didn't want a partner. He was unhappy at ABC, and he was saddled with this woman, and he would go every night across the street before the show and have, I guess, a couple of beers with the guys. It was, it's an all-male club, and they would all sit and talk, about how terrible I was. And the only way that I sort of got through was that I liked the Yankees. I used to go to the Yankee games. And I knew George Steinbrenner. I'd met him, interestingly enough, in Cuba when I went down at one point to interview Fidel. That first interview, because the Yankees was secretly there, and George Steinbrenner was there. First time I'd ever heard of George Steinbrenner. And I put a microphone on to him. What are you doing here? You can imagine how thrilled he was. But we became friends. And so Steinbrenner used to say, this is, watch this, or we're going to do that. So I would come in with all of this stuff about the Yankees, and at least the stagehands would talk to me. And I would make bets with Harry, and sometimes I would win. That was the only kind of communication we had. Otherwise, the studio was cold, and I was frozen out. But it wasn't, Harry wasn't mean. He was unhappy there, and unhappy with me. And as we learned later, going through many things in his private life that none of us knew about at the time.
Did you have any professional support within the, among other journalists during this period of time? Did you?
I had no support. I had nothing but criticism from some very big journalists who then went in the next day and asked for raises and got them because it broke the money barrier. You see, up until then, news people were considered, we were all too pure to make a lot of money. The entertainment figures made huge amounts of money then. I remember Merv Griffin made like 6 times what I was making doing a syndicated show. And we didn't have agents because you weren't supposed to have agents. Now news people have agents and managers and so forth. And the fact that I was being paid that kind of lump sum, remember nobody wrote about the 4 specials. My first one was Barbra Streisand and John Peters and President-elect and Mrs. Jimmy Carter, and I was torn apart for doing that. And the specials continued for 26 years. So I had no support within the company. I had no support until really Rue Knowledge came in.
Why were you torn apart over the specials? Why were you criticized?
Because at the end of the interview with Jimmy Carter, first of all, nobody was doing that kind of specials. Today it's like a magazine show. And by the way, what we found, the first one that we did, as I said, had President-elect and Mrs. Carter. The second one, I think, had Vice President Mondale. Then I did one with the new Queen of Jordan, Queen Noor, and King Hussein, so forth. And though everybody said they loved those, what they wanted were the superstars. And so little by little, my shows turned into superstars. But at the end of the interview with Jimmy Carter, he was talking about what he wanted to do for the country. And I said, be wise with us, Mr. President, be kind to us, or some foolish thing like that, I guess. And probably if Walter Cronkite had said, maybe he wouldn't have, Mr. President, be wise with us and be kind to us, everybody would have said, oh, that's Walter, the great uncle. But with me, they said, that silly, I don't know what, there she goes again, doing another dumb thing.
Well, at the same time, you've got Saturday Night Live on with, we've already mentioned, Gilda Radner. How did you react to that?
I hated the Gilda Radner Bow Wow 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 until I walked into my daughter's room one night and she was up watching it. It was a Saturday night. I said, what are you doing up? And she said, I'm watching Bow Wow Wow Wow, Mom. And I said, well, I mean, look what she's doing. And my daughter said, oh, Mommy, lighten up.
Well,
and then I did.
Well, we're going to cut right here then and change tapes. That's great.
Okay, now we